You're listening to the podcast of The Branch in Ashland, Virginia. Do you like to be warned about potential difficulties and challenges before you face them? And Jesus was pretty clear that association with him would result in difficulties and persecution. The life of faith isn't carefree or challenge-free. In fact, we may face more difficulties as followers of Jesus. As we continue to look at Hebrews 11 today, we look at Moses and the people of God. While we've talked in depth about them in this podcast before, today we're looking at how God gave them enough of a glimpse of himself to propel them along and keep them focused on a future reward. As I reach this place in my life, solidly and firmly planted in middle age, I look over my life and I think there are times in my life I wish somebody had given me some warnings about things. And there's a lot of things as I think about what I'd like to have had warnings for. There are two that stand out for me. First is like living in a house, owning a house, whatever. Nobody gave me a manual the first time I moved into my own house to tell me, when you're supposed to turn the air conditioner on, when you're supposed to turn the heat off, and vice versa. No one told me about air filters and when I was supposed to change air filters. Nobody told me about that I should probably take a leaf blower every couple of years to the air duct that goes from my dryer outside. Otherwise, my neighbors might get a whole big, huge chunk of lint at some point. Nobody told me what to do when the spring in your garage door breaks, if you didn't know that there's a spring in your garage door. And it's the most incredibly awful sound ever when it finally does break. But aside from living in a house and all the warnings I wish people had given me about that, the other thing that I wish people had given me warnings about was being a parent, because nothing can ever prepare you for the way you're supposed to react when your child decides to drop their pants in the middle of a McDonald's lobby and just go to the bathroom right there. Nothing can prepare you for a question from your 3-year-old saying they have to go to the bathroom, and you say, okay, and then you feel a warm wetness on your lap. Nothing can prepare you for what happens when you take your first airplane flight with your child and that child kicks the seat in front of them for the entire 2.5-hour flight. I like warnings for stuff like that, and it would have been nice to have had a warning. And when we think about faith, I think it's safe to say that if we read through the Bible, we're given warnings about what might come when we decide to embrace faith. If anyone hasn't told us what we can expect with faith, then probably they've been skipping certain parts of what's in here, because within the Bible we see that when we embrace faith and follow Jesus, we'll inevitably have to endure hardships for that faith. And we're told that because we're associated with Jesus, we may have difficulties in life. We may have hardships and we may have struggles. We've been looking here at the branch at Hebrews 11, which is called the Hall of Faith, that it's full of people who have gone before us and who have lived in faith, who have shown their faith, and yet who have had some struggles in their faith as well. And so we're going to continue looking at Hebrews 11 today. If you have a Bible, you can turn to Hebrews chapter 11. We're starting in verse 23. If you have an app, you can look there. We'll be reading in the New International Version today. It'll be up on the screen as well. And today we're looking at someone we looked at over the summer. If you joined us or if you were online or listening to the podcast, we went through the book of Exodus, and we looked at Moses. We looked at the people of God as they journeyed through the wilderness. And we're looking back at them today, at both Moses and the Israelites. And so starting in verse 23 of Hebrews 11, we read this: By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he'd grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. And by faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. And by faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. We've been looking at this chapter in Hebrews over the last few weeks. And it's full of people who have gone before, who have shown their faith. And here we're looking at Moses today. And Moses, it says, the writer of Hebrews, says that when he was born, his parents looked at him and they could tell that he was not ordinary. Now, if you go back, this phrase, ordinary, it's translated 3 times in the Bible. You can find this exact same phrase. All 3 times it's referring to Moses and his birth. In the Old Testament, which was originally written in Hebrew, the Hebrew word that's used is tov, which means good. Now, good is a word in Hebrew that's like our word love in English, right? Like you can say, I love pizza, I love my wife, I love my kids, I love baseball, whatever it is. Well, good is the same way, because if we look in Hebrew, think back to, if you're familiar with Genesis, when God was creating everything, at the end of each day, God would say, and he saw that it was good. That same word is tov in Hebrew. And then we see that it's translated in Greek as well. And I'm thinking to myself, all right, Moses is born, and his parents look at him and they say, he's good. And I don't know about any of you, but I was there for the birth of all 3 of my kids. And there are a lot of words I would probably use to describe them when they came out. I don't know if good was one of them. I mean, or not ordinary. Well, that I may have used. But it's amazing to me that Moses' parents, when they saw him, they knew there was something different about him. They knew, whatever it was, call it premonition, maybe God had spoken to them and told them, hey, this is what is going to happen through your son. But whatever it was, it caused them to break the law and to say, we're not going to turn this child in. Because if they had turned the child in, there had been an edict that had been put out by the king, Pharaoh, saying that all male children would be put to death. And so his parents said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to hide him for 3 months. And after those 3 months where they couldn't hide him anymore, they put him in a basket and put him out in the Nile River. I guess they weren't afraid of crocodiles or anything. But there they find, the Pharaoh's daughter finds him and takes him in and raises him as her own. Moses received all these benefits, these blessings, these privileges, because he was known as the daughter, or the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And he had all these things happen that he wouldn't have happened had he been known as a Jew. Because in Egypt at that time, the Jews were enslaved. The Jews were in bondage. And it cost them. And what did Moses do? He said, instead of embracing all that privilege that I have, I'm going to embrace my nationality, my heritage, and I'm going to receive difficult things because of that. Moses told people that he was a Jew. Now, have you ever been in that place before where you told somebody something, and as the moment that you said it, it was like a switch was flipped? Maybe it was I mean, nowadays you could say just about anything and someone's opposed to you about it. But, think about something where you said it and the person just reacted, and all of a sudden it was like a wall was put up. Sometimes when we've told people that, hey, I'm a Christ follower, I'm somebody who embraces faith in Jesus Christ, and they might turn away from you. Maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a boss, maybe it's a family member that says, you know what? Because of who you're associated with, because of who you are, I'm going to turn my back on you. I'm going to treat you different. And in the new year, we're going to talk more about identity. But for now, Moses, he had an identity already. He had an identity as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He knew the privileges that came with that. He knew all the benefits, the luxury of living in the palace. And yet he decided to put that all behind him and to say, you know what, I'm a Jew and I'm going to associate with my people. Moses chose mistreatment. He chose disgrace instead of riches and treasures. But why? Why would he do that? Because of his faith and because Moses looked beyond what was right in front of him. He looked beyond the riches of the palace. He looked beyond all the privilege of being Pharaoh's grandson. And he looked to see the reward that was waiting in the future. It wasn't something that he could necessarily see firsthand. But God gave him glimpses along the way. If we remember back to reading through Exodus, there were different times that God would give Moses a glimpse. When God appeared to Moses right out of the gate, he appeared to him in a bush that was burning and yet was not consumed. And in that bush, Moses could see God. He could see the promise beyond what was right in front of him. God often gives us a small glimpse of himself to keep us looking ahead to what's coming. My question is, what small glimpse has God given you of himself? What has God shown you about himself that's enabled you to look beyond your present circumstances, your temporary hardships or afflictions, mistreatments, disgraces? And is what lies ahead in the future enough to propel you through those afflictions? Can the eyes of faith allow you to see beyond what's right there in front of you? And turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Paul, writing to the early church. Paul, a guy who understood affliction and understood difficulty. He said at the end of chapter 4 in 2 Corinthians, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. And so we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal." The difficulties, the disgraces, the persecution, the mistreatment, all those things that we might experience now, it's really hard to see past them. And I don't think Paul was saying, I don't think the writer of Hebrew was saying to ignore them. So don't hear that in this. The writers aren't saying, hey, pretend that they're not there. Pretend that they don't exist. No. Life is hard. We experience difficult things in life. But do we look beyond what's right in front of us? Do we look beyond? People who know me know I love movies. One of the greatest pictures that I've seen of this is in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. When Frodo has the ring, when he decides he wants to put it on, he can see what other people can't see. He can see a completely different world. And it was actually not always good of what he was doing with that ring. But I think sometimes as followers of Christ, as people of faith, that we need to like put on a ring that helps us to be able to see beyond what's right in front of us. Because when those things are right in front of us, they feel huge. They feel gigantic. They're oppressive. And all they do is want our focus. They want our attention. And we need to look beyond those things. Like Paul said, we need to look beyond what is seen and look at what is unseen. And the only way that we can do that is through the eyes of faith. We can only do it when God allows us to see those things. Now, how did Moses do that? In Hebrews 11, not just Moses, but God's people, the writer of Hebrews gives a few examples of things that he showed them, that God showed them, that would allow them to look through eyes of faith, to look beyond what was right in front of them, and to fix their eyes on what was in the future. The first thing that we see in verse 28 is that God's people saw was the Passover, and we celebrated that together last week as a community with communion. And I think sometimes it's hard for us with just a nice, neat little table and some juice and some bread when we look at it and we say, oh, well, this is a nice meal. And we think about what happened if we read through the Old Testament. This was a bloody thing. Like they literally took the blood of an animal and put it on the doorposts. And that blood was a sign to the destroyer that he would pass over them. That he'd see that blood on the door and just walk past. But if that blood wasn't there, then death was coming to them. And for the Hebrew people and for us, that was just a picture. It was a foretaste. It was just a glimpse of what would come through Jesus Christ later. That Passover, that spotless lamb that was sacrificed, it was something that needed to be done yearly as a reminder to them. And then a baby was born in a manger to bring life and to shed blood that would be put on us as the doors. And so the destroyer would pass over us. And not only would we wouldn't experience spiritual death. You know, the people of God, they didn't experience physical death back then when the Passover happened. But for us who embrace faith in Jesus Christ, the destroyer passes over us. And yes, we experience difficulty, we experience physical death, but we do not experience spiritual death. The thing is, throughout what God showed them, he didn't show them Jesus, but God showed them what it looked like to be spared from death. He showed them a glimpse of Jesus and what Jesus would bring in being spared from spiritual death later on, but he didn't actually show them Jesus. Sometimes God just gives us that small glimpse of what's to come. He's not going to give us so much that we don't have to have faith anymore. But he may give us something that we're just, those among us who like answers, who like warnings, who like all those things, we might say, well, I need more than this, God. I can't just have a little baby born to a teenage mom in a manger. Is that it? That's all I have? I want more. I want to see. But God says, no, I'm going to give you a glimpse. I'm going to let you see a small little foretaste of what's to come. In verse 29, it says that the people of God passed through the Red Sea on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried, they were drowned. And God showed his people that as they were there wondering, where do we go now? Stuck between a sea and an army, not being able to fight, thinking to themselves, how are we going to get out of this? And God parted the sea and allowed them to walk on dry land. And when the Pharaoh and his army followed after, they drowned. You see, they didn't see Jesus either, but God made a way where there was no way before. God made a way where there hadn't been a way before, and he allowed them to go through. That way didn't exist before. They wondered, how are we going to do this? And then God made a way where there wasn't a way before. And then the third example was in verse 30, that the walls of Jericho fell. And if you spent any time in Sunday school, maybe you heard the story of the walls of Jericho, that they marched around for 7 days and then they blew their horns. And any of us who have had kids who have been learning an instrument know that that could be enough to make walls come down. But the walls of that city came down. It wasn't because they were so powerful, they were so mighty. It wasn't because they had a strong army. It was because God had gone before them and they followed God's instruction. You see, they didn't see Jesus, but they had a glimpse of what salvation and victory looked like. None of these instances could they see Jesus, in none of them. They could see a glimpse of him. They might say, hey, there's somebody who's coming who will do this for us, who will spare us from death, who will make a way where there has been no way before, will allow us to experience salvation and victory. But what does he look like? Who is it? And they're only given a glimpse of what that was. You know, this time of year, a lot of times people will spend in the Gospels, especially Matthew and Luke, where we read about Jesus and his birth. And there's a man named Simeon who was mentioned in the Bible, a man who had lived so many years with faith, trusting. And his mother Mary brought Jesus to Simeon in the temple. And when Simeon saw him, he knew. Just kind of like how Moses' parents looked at him and said, there's something different here. There's something about him that's not ordinary, that's good, that's tov. When Simeon saw the baby Jesus, he knew that all of my life I've been having faith. All the difficulties that my people have experienced, all the troubles and hardships, they were all worth it because I see this baby. And I know what this baby is going to accomplish. Simeon probably died not too long after that. He didn't see exactly what Jesus did, but he knew. He knew that he was the one who had been promised. God had given him a glimpse. And because he had that glimpse, he looked beyond the present and he looked to a future that would hold all those things. That would hold salvation, that would hold hope for him. And God showed them hope. God showed Simeon hope. God shows us hope in the form of a little baby born to us. To us is born a child. What is hope again? It's believing in what we can't see. But there's always something. There's always some small glimpse, some small foretaste of what is to come. And God gives us those things. And my question to us this morning is, what hardship are we facing that we need to see beyond? And again, please hear this, that I'm not saying that hardships are things to be ignored. When anyone who knows my story and about, losing both my parents before I turned 40, like when my mom was given her cancer diagnosis and she was getting treatment, at no point during that did we ignore what was right in front of us. We didn't ignore that the doctors had given us this this incredibly difficult diagnosis. We continued to press through that. We didn't fixate and focus on it. We looked beyond. And in this life, my mom wasn't healed, but in the next life, she is. And we need to move beyond. I mean, again, I think we as a culture stink at this instant gratification. We need things like now or yesterday. And it's so hard for us to see beyond these difficulties that are in front of us. We're given difficult diagnosis. Something happens in a relationship that breaks down. We suffer abuse at the hands of somebody else. All those things have the potential of letting our eyes get so focused on them. Yes, God needs to bring us healing through those things. But he also needs to give us hope to see beyond them, to know that those things were never his intention at all. It wasn't his intention for people to die of cancer, for people to be abused, for divorce to happen, for brokenness to be in the world. But it is his intent to repair and to make all things new again, not to ignore them or gloss over them, but to see beyond them. What do we need to see beyond? And so what do we do with all this? First of all, just the acknowledgement right off the bat that we will face hardships. And if I ever stand up here, or anybody else ever stands up here and says anything other than that, then you have my permission to go Old Testament or New Testament on them and stone them, okay? Not like in the, marijuana kind of way, but, But you have permission to say, hey, you're preaching the wrong thing here. Because we will face hardships. And I'm not saying this to scare people. I'm not saying this so that you're like, yeah, peace out. I'm not going back there again. That's what they talk about. But just to prepare, to warn. The second thing is this: what small glimpse of God has he shown you? In the midst of the difficulties, in the midst of the hardships and the struggles and the trials in life, what small glimpse has he shown you to look beyond them? To see beyond, to give you future hope for what is to come. And then the third question, the third thing is, are you looking ahead to your reward? There are so many things that I think, we need community. I had an experience this week where a friend came and we were doing something together, was struggling, and by the end of our time together, because we served, because we came together using our gifts for God's kingdom, at the end there was a completely different demeanor on my friend, and I thought, this is what community is about. When we come together and we say, you know what, I'm having a crappy day. I'm having a crappy month. Maybe I'm having a crappy year. All of us have had a COVID year, right? And that hasn't been fun. But when we come together, God can help us show each other those glimpses to say, hey, have you thought about this? Have you seen this? And maybe God's trying to show you this. And we see beyond what's right in front of us, and we look ahead to the reward that's waiting there. We don't follow Jesus because of a reward. We follow Jesus because of what he's done. Because he gives us life, and not just life eternal, but life abundant here and now. The benefit of that is that there is a reward for that. Are we looking beyond these momentary difficulties and seeing the reward that's lying in the future for us? Let me pray. God, thank you for being honest with us. That life is hard. That there are difficulties that we will face, we will experience. And yet, God, we need to not fixate on them. We need to look beyond. But God, that's hard. It's so hard to look beyond the things that overtake us, that knock us down, and that kick us when we're down there. And so, God, remind us of the hope that your Son Jesus has given to us. And may we put that hope in him alone as we come to worship, come to adore that baby born who grew up to be a Passover lamb for us. I pray, God, that you would remind us of your faithfulness, remind us of your love for us. In Jesus' name, amen. The Israelites didn't see Jesus, but God showed them what it looked like to be spared from death. The Israelites didn't see Jesus, but God made a way where there had been no way before. And the Israelites didn't see Jesus, but they had a glimpse of what salvation and victory looked like. What small glimpse is God giving you of himself to allow you to stay focused on a future hope and reward? I hope that through whatever difficulties and challenges you may be facing, God is still showing himself to you. And I pray that he'll help you to see past what's right in front of you to the future reward he has for you. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to our podcast. If you have any comments or questions, please email us at thebranchashland@gmail.com. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe, give us a review, and share with your friends wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time.